the stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums. Today's episode is the story of the Beatles. The Beatles were formed in 1957 as a band in northern England in Liverpool. They were named the Quarrymen after the high school that John Lennon attended, Quarrybank High School. From a little band that played a type of music called British skiffle based on early U.S. bluegrass, country, and folk music, complete with banjos, washboards as instruments, the Beatles worked hard in small clubs to ultimately release albums and tours that revolutionized rock music and modern culture with their longer hair, original songwriting skills, and intriguing personalities. And if you thought the Beatles had a squeaky clean image, you may be shocked by what you're about to hear from our guest. As you will hear, the Beatles may very well have created the template for future rock stars' offstage indulgences. Band members John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr have gone on to become household names, and the Beatles have sold over 500 million albums, an astonishing figure given that they only put out albums for 7 short years between 1963 and 1970. Almost every performer that followed pointed to the Beatles as an inspiration and included a diverse set of performers like James Taylor, David Bowie, the Eagles, Kiss, Bruce Springsteen, Tom Petty, on through Oasis and Nirvana. Here to discuss the Beatles is Bob Spitz, author of the massive bestseller, The Beatles, the Biography. Bob also appeared on one of our most popular episodes, The Story of Led Zeppelin, and was the author of Led Zeppelin, the Biography. In addition to writing about Bob Dylan, Bob Spitz was previously a rock insider as a manager of both Bruce Springsteen and Elton John. He's currently working on his next project, a Rolling Stones biography. Welcome back to Garage to Stadiums, Bob.
Always a pleasure to be here, Dave. Always.
Great to have you. How many copies did this book must have sold well?
The Beatles,
it's awesome.
It's sold over a million copies. Yeah.
Wow.
Thanks.
Congrats.
It still sells. I mean, you know, it's the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah. Good for you, because in your at the end of the book where you write about the other books, they're underwhelming.
To say the least. Yeah.
Which is why yours stands out. Who did you talk to directly for the book?
For the Beatles, I talked.
Like in terms of the Beatles, did you talk to
I did.
Paul,
I talked to Paul and I talked to George before he died. Spent quite a bit of time with both of them. And and Paul gave me access to everybody. I mean, I was the first person in 40 years. They had a kind of a silence on their friends and colleagues and families. If you talked to the press, you were out. And so nobody talked to the press. And I would call these people and relatives of Paul who had never talked and said, Paul told me to talk to you. And they'd go, wait a second. They'd come back and they'd go, you're right. I've got stories to tell you. I've been waiting 40 years to tell these stories. Yeah, it was great. It was fun. Incredible. You know what I've been doing for the last 4 years?
What have you been doing?
I've been the Rolling Stones biographer.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You told us that during the Led Zeppelin show. I can't wait.
It's done. I turned it in 2 weeks ago. So.
And did you talk to Mick and Keith, or were you allowed access?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I've known Keith for 40 years. We were neighbors in New York for a long time.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. What the two sort of the pantheon of the 60s, the Stones and the Beatles, my goodness.
And Dylan. I was Dylan's first biographer.
We're going to talk about perhaps, well, if not the most, one of the most seminal rock acts in the history of music. And to do so, I want to go way back to the Liverpool days where these boys grew up. And I want you to tell us a little about them as adolescents and how they all came together.
Well, you know, the Beatles were really an eclectic bunch. They, as you mentioned, they came out of Liverpool, and aside from John, these were not even middle class guys. They were all working class, blue collar. Um, People like George hardly ever showed up in school, never played hooky all the time, went to the movies instead of going to school. Ringo never spent a day in school. Ringo was a sickly boy, had polio as a young kid, and was in a hospital for most of his childhood. And I mean, look at Ringo today. You know, he's 85 years old and he looks better than you and me. Um, and of course, John and Paul. Paul was a smart guy, but really never pushed himself in school. And John was a messed up young kid. So they were all wayward in Liverpool. They really had no sense of a future, no sense of a career. They didn't know what they were going to do. And music saved their lives. It really did. And it brought them together in such a unique way and in such a unique environment that everything that we got later on came from that dissociation.
They also had some tragedy in their families, didn't they? A couple of them, a few of them, actually.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, Paul's mother died very young. And there's an instance in the book that I think when I turned in the manuscript to the Beatles, my publisher pulled me aside and said, Paul's mother's death was one of the most touching things in the book. I had come across an aunt of his who lived in Wales, had never spoken to the press, and she went with Mary McCarthy the last day that she spent at home. She took her to the hospital, and of course they were so poor that these two women went to the hospital on a bus. But she said right before they were supposed to get on the bus, Mary turned back and ran to the house and said, and I told Paul this, and he put his head in his hands and cried. Mary went back to the house and laid out the boys' clothes for school the next day, knowing she would never come back.
Wow.
So I mean, there was that kind of tragedy in Paul's house. John, uh, John's childhood was just a complete mess. His mother and father divorced very early. Uh, his father went out to sea. He was an entertainer on cruise ships, never saw his son. His mother, his mother was a good time gal. Uh, she went with some of the military guys who had a base outside of Liverpool, and really didn't have much to do with the upbringing of her son. John was shunted off to his aunt's house, his famous aunt Mimi's house, to bring him up with a stern hand. And so when John was about 11 years old, both his mother and father came back into his life. But his mother, just as he was getting to know her again, just as she put a guitar in his hands and taught him how to use it, his mother was run over by a teacher and killed instantly. And so, yeah, they had really hard lives. You know, George grew up poor. Ringo grew up poor. Um, Paul and John have these tragedies. And so it was a hard scrabble life for these Liverpool guys.